Today on the Woven Energy podcast.
Meditating under a waterfall with your top off in the winter. You know, this is what they call aragyo.
Have you tried it?
Of course I've tried it, mate. Have I ever? Have I ever? Looking back, I think so many occasions I could have broke my neck, but actually the spirit of the place does indeed guide you, and the wild hunter, the wild run, is a beautiful exercise. It's amazing. One of the wonderful things written about her, she stood on a mountain and she looked out over her realm and she saw what's described as the shape of all shapes as they moved together as one being. So I put something in a box and I put a label on it. Oh, there's my job done, you know. Siberian shaman, yes. Tribal religion box, he goes in there. And then, I don't know, a lama from Tibet, he can go in the Buddhism box, you know. That's my job over. And unfortunately, you know, nature's not as simple as that. There were shamans, they're multi-purpose people. There were shamans, and you know, sometimes they were chiefs and sometimes they were healers.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 6 of the Woven Energy podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and of course Damon Smith. We are here once again to talk about shamanism from the ground up. So this week is going to be a very interesting episode. We are going to talk about a few other techniques that, shamanic techniques that Damon has experience in. As we've said a few times, Damon's forte or personal preferred shamanic technique is the animal spirit dance, which we are going to come on to in lots of detail. But I thought it'd be very interesting to talk about a few other techniques, because as soon as you get to a certain stage in your journey into shamanism, it's quite a personal choice, or you might find a personal connection with any one or a few of the literally thousands of valid shamanic techniques out there. So, as a brief overview of what we've talked about so far regarding the stages of shamanism, you have to go through stage 1 and 2. You have to go through stages 1 and 2 in some shape or form. It's quite universal in its principles and what the foundation of shamanic technique is built on. So, in stage 1, we have Chelicity in English, or the Baktamshtesaub in Mongol. And this is, as Damon has described, becoming like a capacious container. It is ridding yourself of your social conditioning, your cultural biases, your baggage, emptying yourself in a way that nature can come into you or interact with you unfiltered. Ordinary Zen type of meditation that doesn't rely on imagination can help you with this. And if you don't do this already, start now. Just start. We are going to go over many more techniques and exercises regarding this stage in episode 7, the next episode, so look out for that. Stage 2 is the breath, or the eschim, and this is about developing an intimate familiarity with your breath and the vitality it brings. Again, this is something we're going to come on to in more depth also. So we've talked about stages 1 and 2, and so we're going to skip past stages 1 and 2 a little bit now onto stage 3 to just put that into context. So with stage 3, this is where real shamanic technique begins, and I'm looking forward to this episode as much as you, because most of what I've personally done with Damon is the animal spirit dance, and so this is all going to be new stuff for me also. So I'm going to firmly pass you all over to our expert Damon to take us through what a few other techniques are and what other techniques he's tried. So, Damon, you have led a very interesting life, and I know you've had a lot of experience with shamanism, both academically as well as experientially. So,
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, well, I guess one of the things to say about this review is that we, as you said, we intend to go through animal spirits and the animal spirit dance in some depth on these podcasts. We haven't done that yet, but I think it is a good idea to do a quick review of some other shamanistic techniques, if for no other reason than we are not given the impression that shamanism is all about animal spirits and the animal spirit dance. Certainly not. One of the great things about shamanism is the truly vast range of techniques that are associated with it. And also, I think a good place to start with this, one of the things I should say is that some of this stuff I'm going to talk about is from 30 years ago. Yes, so some of it is more recent, and but I thought it was worth also making that point. The if you think of the 7 stages of becoming a shaman, the spirit journey is obviously what everybody thinks about. Everybody thinks about that, The shaman steps outside of mundane reality and into the realm of the spirit and gains knowledge from nature, direct knowledge from nature in a way that an average human being, even in an animistic society, is never going to experience. But shamanistic technique, or the techniques employed by both shamans and esotericists, as we've said before, esotericists being members of settled civilized societies like ourselves who think there's still some value in shamanistic technique. They're not all as heavyweight as what I would describe as heavyweight as the actual spirit journey itself. So I think a good place to start is shamanistic techniques that are simply an extension of Chilicity, the training in Chilicity, Bhaktamshte Sab. In Chinese secret societies and in Chinese esotericism, these are sometimes referred to as Michuan, and they employ Chilicity in practical ways. So this is a story from close to 30 years ago. One of my guides, one of my teachers, if you like, used to take me out into wild places, relatively wild places. It actually was in Scotland. And we would generally go out into the woods, and we would do this at night. Not during the daytime. Well, we would do it during the daytime, but usually it was at night. And one of the many things that I was asked to do was practice my Chilicity alone. I think we mentioned this completely alone practice. And to practice in the woods, this idea that we talked about before, like becoming like a tea bag in the ocean, the water that's inside of you and the water that's outside of you, i.e. the spirit that's inside of you and the spirit that's outside of you, are one and the same. They're not separate. And I think also, as we said before, as a shaman, somebody's interested in shamanism, you cannot practice Chilicity too much. Chilicity is your weapon against the miasma. So one of the practices that my teacher got me doing was simply to move through the woods in this state, while maintaining the state. Actually, he gave me a much easier exercise, which is simply because I sort of had discussion with him, and I didn't sort of believe that you could maintain Chilicity while really walking or maintaining normal functions, So one of the early techniques I was given to practice was just simply to walk to some goal, probably about half a mile away, while maintaining Chilicity. And this is just in everyday life, without thinking. And I was like, how can I possibly get there without thinking? But it turns out you can. Your body, your spirit are able to achieve this. You'd be quite surprised what you can achieve. And it actually goes further than that, which I'll come on to.
A bit like driving a car to a destination.
Exactly.
And you forget about your destination.
You're very, very familiar with car driving. You do it a lot. I spend a lot of my job keeps me on the road. And you go on automatic. And you're not necessarily thinking about anything at all. So I practiced this actively. This was one of the exercises. And then we would go out into the woods. And I practiced this quite a lot. We'll come on to some examples of the things that there were various variations on this. But you can imagine me walking through the woods on some hills. These are the Uch Hills in Scotland where I was. Walking through the woods very late at night. Preferably when it's overcast. For this type of exercise, you want it to be as dark as possible. And I practiced this a lot, and it was really, really interesting, really enlightening to be part of that place, to become part of this place over a period of time. To start off with, I wasn't very good at it, but, over time, my Chilicity improved, and I could just be, people would say, be one with the trees and with the ground and with the air and the spirits. And at after a year, probably about a year or more's practice of this, I really felt like I was doing it quite often. I really felt like I was part of that place. There was no difference between what was inside me and what was outside of me in these Michuan exercises, for want of a better word. And there was one occasion when I was walking through the woods and I saw a deer, and it was almost magical. That sort of thing. People use that to shamanistic technique. They use that term magical. We need to be careful with that. Because of Western views of what magic means. But anyway, I walked right up to this deer. I stood right next to it. It wasn't a big deer. It came up to about my chest. And I stood right next to it. Now, I don't know what happened with this deer, but I'm literally standing with the side of my leg against its body, standing beside it, looking in the same direction that it was kind of looking, except deers obviously have a wider field of view than me. And it was there, and then of course I thought, wow, this is amazing. The Chelicity collapsed. I was dragged straight down to the baseline because I immediately thought, why is this possible? Why hasn't the deer run off? And sure enough, as soon as I thought that, the deer did run off. But it was an incredible experience. And actually, we want to keep this quite brief, but any one of these things. So there's an example of Michuan. That's taking Chelicity, the exercise of Chelicity, and extending it further into a shamanistic exercise. And there's an example of one, simply moving through the woods. Now, quite a well-known.
Well, it's interesting what you were saying last episode about the animals, like how they would see you, because it's interesting to think about what on earth the deer must have been going through. Yeah, to just stand there when you were there.
Yeah, I mean, I my rationalization at the time, being a biologist, was that the deer, deer have this freeze reaction. Because they're quite well camouflaged, they stay still until they're sure that the person or the danger that may be approaching them is definitely approaching them, in case it hasn't seen them. But in this case, I have to say, there's no way that the deer couldn't have known I was there, unless it was this effect. You got to remember, in those days, it's 30 years ago, I also wasn't as experienced as I am today. I might have, if I'd been able to experience that today, I'd probably been able to pick up on exactly what was going on there. But these are not tame deer. These are not your tame deer in the park. These are proper wild deer who, I don't think many people knew there were deer in there, and it was quite interesting that I could actually touch with the side of my leg this deer, and it didn't notice me. But then, as soon as I started thinking about why is it not running away, then it ran away. Yeah. So there's one. Now, with all of these examples that I'm going to give, there's a problem that we could start diving down into them, and we'll end up doing an episode on each one. So I need to be a little bit disciplined about this. Another extension, which people may have heard of, is the wild hunt or the wild run. This is something from European mythology. It's something that's in Scandinavian mythology and many other mythologies, but it does have the taste of something very shamanistic. Another thing that my teacher guide got me doing once I became good at this, and I don't recommend doing this until you're very, very confident of your Chelicity, is literally in pitch dark to run as fast as you can through the woods. I was always on a hillside because these were hills, wooded hills, to run through the woods. Now, this is probably quite a dangerous thing to do, but in a state of Chelicity, once you get the hang of it, the spirit of the place can guide you, so you're not wrong-footed. I guess I was moderately young, probably about 20, early 20s, or maybe even 20. And I just think, looking back, I think so many occasions I could have broke my neck, but actually the spirit of the place does indeed guide you. And the wild hunter, the wild run, is a beautiful exercise. It's amazing. It's like you have Mother Nature at your back, protecting you, steering you through the place, steering you through the trees, steering you through the land, and you can feel it, and you can feel where the danger is. Danger in terms of footing, and you can feel where the sure footing is. And it's shamanism that the place teaches you. But my point with these particular exercises is these are not full-blown spirit journey. These are simply extensions of Chillicity. The full extent of shamanistic technique has to be seen at all of the levels, at all of the stages of becoming a shaman, and there are lots and lots. And maybe at a later date, or maybe when we discuss Chillicity, we can give some more examples of shamanistic exercises that are simply exercises for practicing Chillicity.
Yeah.
Another one that you mentioned on a previous podcast is this confusion about the traveling down to the underworld and traveling up to the sky. And this is interpreted as a spirit journey, but actually this is more about Chillicity again. In a lot of traditions, we mentioned Mithraism, for instance, as the belief in the exoteric ideas within that, the exoteric mythology was, as the soul came down to Earth, it passed through 7 stages, represented by the 7 planets. There were 7 planets at that time.
Yeah.
And as it passed each shell, as it came down to Earth on birth, when the baby was going to be born, it took on a character from each shell. So there's a kind of symbolic death and rebirth that's practiced as a different way to look at Chillicity. We mentioned 3 main principles or pillars or axes of Chillicity, but there's another way to think about Chillicity, because it's about social conditioning and taking on things without knowing you're taking on things. Your culture and your worldview coming from people rather than from nature. You take on aspects as you go through life. Even when you're born, it starts. And so that in many traditions, many shamanistic and esoteric traditions, there's this symbolic reversal of that. The shaman or the esotericist goes back through those 7 stages, shedding what was taken on at each of those shells. And maybe we'll talk about that on a later podcast. But this can be seen as traveling to the underworld or traveling up into the sky, figuratively speaking. And many traditions, when you travel, for instance, in Siberia, when the shaman travels down to the underworld, he goes down through, guess how many levels? 7. Yeah. 7. Down into the underworld. But I think there's been some confusion about this, because I think when people in the West or people from civilization hear about this, the shaman travels up to the upper realm or the lower realm, the people have mistaken that or confused that with a spirit journey. And actually it's just a different way at looking at the subject of Chillicity. And again, we could dive down into that and probably do a whole podcast on that. But
well, just literally off the top of my head, regarding the 7 stages, which I think is very interesting. You've got two, which there's many of them, but 2 springs to mind. That's the chemical wedding of Christiana Rosenkreuz. It's 7 days.
Sure.
There's also one in Jainism. If you look at Jainism, and you look at the 3 realms that's depicted in Jainism, it's interesting. The baseline, we'd call the baseline, which they call the Naraka, has 7 stages.
Right.
The abode of the hellish beings.
Sure.
It's called. It's really interesting.
And interestingly, you will find this stuff in the Old Testament, Ezekiel in particular. Again, we could probably do several podcasts just on that. So yeah, you'll find this everywhere. You will find this everywhere.
Did you mention Dante's Inferno? I can't remember. Yeah.
I didn't mention it, but you have.
Yeah, that's it as well.
Yeah. And we previously mentioned the 7 stages inside Mithraism. Yeah. And so on and so on. But basically, what the point that I was trying to make there, without going into too much depth, because again,
I just find it so fascinating. I really do.
Yeah, sure. But the point I was trying to make was, this is not the full-blown spirit journey. This is simply another way of looking at chillicity. And maybe when we do chillicity, we'll have a talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving along. Well, I mentioned that. Several times, probably too much now, that my forte, my specialism is the animal spirits and animal spirit dance, because I love them so dearly, and because they've had such a great effect on my life. Then I feel quite good about them in general. Probably why I mention them a lot. In Siberia and Mongolia, there is an associated practice which I've also tried myself. Which is what I would call symbolic spirit animals, or symbolic spirits of all kinds. Ongot, it could be ancestors. Ongot, they're called in Mongol. And the shaman in many different societies, people think of the shaman's costume. The shaman wears a costume, and one of the things that we used to do, academically speaking, is we would compare the costumes of shamans from around the world. Seeing how different they all were and cataloguing them, this type of thing, without really seeing the similarity, which is what's important. Now, a shaman's costume isn't a costume. What it is that the shaman uses implements like the drum, tools, if you like, that promote the shamanistic technique. And the things that shaman wears are no different from this. So shamans all over the world tend to wear something unusual, especially when they're going into a shamanistic state. In Siberia, and to a certain extent in Mongolia, a shaman's costume is not really anything like a costume. It's more like whole heaps of things that he hangs on himself, animal skins and various other implements. And also, which is what I'm coming on to, symbolic spirit animals. So these are animals and figures, sometimes just circles that represent spirits, human conceptualizations of spirits, or spirits in general. They cut these things sometimes out of felt, sometimes out of very thin metal. Very thin metal was what I used, and having done that, these things are actually attached to the already rich costume. And when you move, when you're doing any kind of shamanic movement or movement that's there to promote chillicity or other types of shamanistic activity, these things create unusual feelings on your body. And those unusual feelings that they create on your body are, again, just like the rhythm of the drum. They're there to promote a non-ordinary state. They're not things that you experience day to day. And the symbols are there also in a way of identifying yourself with the spirit animals. So I would personally cut out a very thin metal with some tin snips, shapes of different animals that I took as my spirit guides, and I would dress myself in various things. It certainly didn't look like a grand Siberian shaman's costume or anything, but to have the same effect, sometimes tie something around my eyes so I couldn't see. Sometimes I would have something veiling my face to stop the light coming in too much. But generally, to embody the spirit animals in that way, to try and reinforce them. So I count this as a separate technique from how I normally deal with and practice spirit animals and spirit animal dance.
Okay, great. So moving along, I know you have a lot to talk about regarding the I Ching and the Book of Changes, the baseline, the midline, and the top line. You've talked about it a few times on these podcasts, but I also know that you have direct experience with them, and how they are a deeply shamanic text, or the heart of the ideas behind the I Ching are deeply shamanic. So do you want to talk about that for a bit?
Sure. So we talked a lot about our baseline bias, and when we approach life in settled society, we tend to analyze stuff. It's something that we do, and it was inevitable that somebody somewhere would take effectively the shamanistic concept of the three realms and do a huge amount of analysis on it. It was just going to happen. And this is effectively what the Book of Changes, the I Ching, is. It's an ancient Chinese classic that uses lines to represent each of the three realms. The Chinese and some other shamanistic or semi-shamanistic societies, Chinese being people who have the longest continuous civilization. What I mean is the longest strand of civilization with effectively the same or very similar culture, going back, at least 5,000 years anywhere in the world. So obviously their civilization, their culture derives a lot from those early people like the Anshao that we talked about. There's a lot of stuff survives in China, although it's been exotericized into things like, for instance, Taoism. The I Ching is an ancient book that examines each of the three realms in terms of these concepts of yin and yang. Probably everybody's heard of yin and yang. Literally speaking, yin and yang, or yang is the sunny side of a hill, and yin is the dark, the shaded side of a hill. And this use of characters, or this use of words, tries to show their interrelatedness. The three realms are ultimately all about energy and how energy changes, as we've said before, throughout all time and in all places. The I Ching, in its original form, catalogues that in a way, all of the possible changes in terms of yin changing to yang in each of those three realms. At some time, we probably best do a podcast on yin and yang, possibly more than one. But I presume most people are fairly familiar with these concepts. In the book, a yang line is represented by a solid line, and a yin line is represented by a broken line. And the yang line, the yin line, can occur for any of the three realms. So obviously that's 2 times 2 times 2, that's eight possibilities in terms of the three realms. But then when you look at a human being, and then you look at the situation or the environment or the temporal changes in which that human being finds themselves, effectively the microcosm and the macrocosm. The I Ching, it stacks 2 trigrams. It sticks one on top of the other. And the lower one represents the situation, the current thing of focus, like a human being. And the upper one represents the context, the context in which that change is happening. So the change that's happening within the microcosm, the change that's happening within the macrocosm. And then there are some what I would call flavor words, things that give a sense of what this change means in the real world, in nature. This was the original nature of the I Ching. But one of the things that I would warn people interested in shamanism against is the fact that if you walk into a bookshop and buy the copy of the I Ching today, most of the text in that book will have nothing to do with what I would call the I Ching. It will have everything to do with Confucianism, the great Confucian tradition of China, which is although it's a great tradition, it's a heavy baseline tradition. So what I tend to tell people to do if they buy themselves a copy of the I Ching is completely ignore the commentary, the copious commentary that exists on copies of the I Ching today.
Well, why don't you just take a second? I mean, you've given people so much information on these podcasts so far. I know you do have a book yourself out on the I Ching, which has no commentary in it.
Yeah,
it has a very,
you
know, you've spent a long time working on that. So I think it's worth.
Is this the book plug, Joe?
Yeah, this is the book plug. Why not?
Well, all it is, I did spend a long time working on that, and all it is a version of the I Ching with all of the copious Confucian commentary taken out. You've got to understand that in China as a nation, the civil service examinations were based on pretty much, we're talking about for thousands of years. The civil service examinations in China were based entirely on almost entirely on the Confucian classics. So the I Ching was actually one of these, but it wasn't the original I Ching. It was the I Ching that had been bulked out with loads of Confucian commentary. So to take out the commentary for a Chinese person to take out the commentary would be quite a big deal. It's sort of throwing away a very large part of your heritage. But as you know, I'm not a Chinese person, so I did the deed. And there's a thing called the Western White Tiger I Ching, and that's basically I took a pair of scissors to the I Ching, and so what's left in there is what I would call the shamanic heart of the book. Yeah. So
I'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks for that. So that kind of leads us into the thing that got me into shamanism in the first place, which is Xingyi, we've mentioned before. In Xingyi, just like in spirit dance, you embody the characters of animals, but it's not like spirit dance where you're embodying the flavor and the character of the whole of the animal's life. You're in a martial arts context, you tend to be, in the case of most of the animals, you tend to be mimicking its predatory or defensive behavior, predatory or anti-predatory behavior. But it is shamanistic. You do take on that essence. Another thing you might like to put in the notes is there's a friend of mine and Joe's called Paul Andrews, who's done a very interesting video of him doing free linking, what's called free linking. Lian Huan is linking in Xingyi. Free linking snake. Do you know the one I'm talking about, Joe?
Oh yeah, I know which one.
So maybe that's something else you could put in the links below if you like. I thought that was very good. You can really, what I was talking about the other time, where if you're doing it right, you can really see the flavor of the animal in the movements. So that's Paul doing his Xingyi like that. And this is a very, very, what I call a very, very narrow and niche application of shamanistic technique. I take on the flavor of the animal, not necessarily the whole animal like in spirit dance, not the whole of the animal's life, but just the bits of the animal that revolve around predation and anti-predatory behavior. Because those animals have evolved those ways of being, that spirit that makes them effective in that way. You think of an eagle. The spirit that makes it effective and allows it to eat and allows it to feed its young. It's developed that over millions of years. So obviously, as a human being, if I'm interested in martial arts, then taking on that spirit will be potentially quite useful for me, because that I'm taking, we talked about nature being the teacher in shamanism rather than human beings being the teacher. I'm taking on the spirit of an animal that has all of this experience, this genetic or hereditary and learned experience, and then using it. It's like pinching it in order so that I can do my martial arts somewhat more effectively than I would be able to otherwise.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's almost like human beings. It's the task of human beings with regards to Xingyi to kind of put our quote unquote ego to one side and learn from the animals and not think we're above the animals.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Xingyi, there are basically 12 animals. There are 11 real animals. One of the interesting ones is the chicken, in that's not what I described. That's what's called intraspecific aggression in biology. That's where males compete with each other. It was the basis of cockfighting. And so they do give this one example of that within a species, but for all the other examples, it's either predatory or anti-predatory behavior. And then there's the other animal, which is dragon. The dragon being the symbol of the noble aspect of the human spirit. And in Xingyi, it represents the attributed founder of that art, General Yu Fei, who's a very, very famous Chinese general from Song Dynasty. Incidentally, not exactly the same time, but round about the same time as Fan Quan, the artist that we talked about. And Yu Fei was also a member of the movement, the movement, having a respect for nature that Fan Quan was a part of. Although Fan Quan expressed himself through his painting, Yu Fei expressed himself on the battlefield, and actually Yu Fei was very, very successful. But in Xingyi, there's this animal, the dragon. The dragon represents the human spirit. We were talking about spirit animals allowing you to look back at yourself as a human being, but as an animal, as a human being, not as a civilized human being. And that's what the dragon's about in Xingyi. It represents Yu Fei on the one hand, but on the other hand, it represents not the whole of the human spirit, but that part of the human spirit, which is what I use the word most noble. Yu Fei was an example of somebody who was selfless. He sacrificed himself for the good of the country. Whereas that's another thing that I liked about Xingyi compared to other martial arts. Some other martial arts that I've studied, the founders of other martial arts, the stories about the founders of other martial arts are stories of some martial artist inventing a new style or system and then beating up the other martial artists to show how much more effective his system is. Whereas the story of the founder of Xingyi is completely different from that. It's about a man who laid down his own life deliberately in order to avoid civil war in China. Total altruistic selflessness. So that's what I mean by the dragon. Dragon's what's human and what's effectively made human beings successful throughout our evolution is this collaborative aspect. By ourselves, and certainly without our tools, we're pretty useless. If you imagine a human being trying to fight a tiger, for instance, without any weapons, it's a non-starter really, But when we collaborate, when we can, first of all, make our tools, but then we collaborate as a group, we become a hunting party, with spears, and we pass on our experience and our closeness to nature in an animistic way, then we can become dangerous. We're a dangerous animal. And that's what I got out of Xingyi. And really, Xingyi wasn't an example of a shamanistic technique. For me, Xingyi was the shamanistic technique that got me into or moved me into all of the other shamanistic techniques. There's an associated art that isn't very widely known, but what it's part of is quite widely known. There's a thing called Qigong in China. And Xingyi, some traditions in Xingyi have a version of this called Yanyi, which is exploring your physical movement and exploring the animals and exploring these strategies without taking into account kind of combative reality that you would get in a martial art. And it's like a way of, it's not really a way of learning anything. It's just a way of exploring yourself. A bit like, I don't know if anybody's come across the Feldenkrais method, or a guy called Mosh Feldenkrais came up with if you like, a Western version of this. If anybody's not interested in, well, I guess if you're interested in shamanism, the midline is very, very important. And the link between the midline and the spirit and the baseline, that is the link between the trunk of the tree, the branches and leaves and the roots is very, very important. This guy, Mosh Feldenkrais, wrote an excellent book. It's not too long a book. It's a short book called Awareness Through Movement. There's another one that we can perhaps... and that is a really interesting book. And so Yanyi and the Feldenkrais method, these two things are so similar to each other. It's quite surprising how similar to each other they are.
Yeah, I'll put another link to that in the show notes.
So,
it's a good example that of how shamanism, it's not about looking at a YouTube video of a shaman dressed up in animal skins and dancing around and going, oh, that's shamanism and categorizing it. You're talking about somebody could learn shamanism through a book called Awareness Through Movement. It's such a huge concept. That
book, in my opinion, we talked about the 7 stages. That book doesn't really address anything beyond what I would call stage 4. And mostly it would stop at stage 3. But yeah, it's another example of this thing occurring again and again and again whenever anybody, as Marsh Feldenkrais did, whenever anybody takes a new look at things and doesn't make assumptions, doesn't make assumptions based on their social conditioning, their social upbringing, but goes back and looks at something again new. And he did that with the human body and human movement. And surprise, surprise, what he came up with, quite independently, I believe, was something that was very animistic and possibly slightly shamanistic in its nature. On another occasion, I'm trying to crack on here. We'll be here we'll be here on this podcast for a week. On another occasion, I studied sometimes called the Sixiang or Yuancheng in China. You mentioned in a different podcast, you mentioned astrology. Well, this is kind of, it's Chinese astrology. And this is the Sixiang are 4 groups of constellations, not 4 constellations, but 4 groups of traditional Chinese constellations. And they're given figurative names. For instance, there's the azure dragon and the white tiger, and we might as well do them all. There's the dark turtle, or sometimes called the dark warrior. And then there's what they call the vermilion bird of the south. And these 4 mega constellations are composed of small sub-constellations. And these things, again, come in 7s. Surprise, surprise. So if we take Qinglong, for instance, which is the azure dragon, this kind of represents the spring. Qinglong gives you 7 ways, again, extensions of Chelicity, 7 ways to employ Chelicity in terms of dealing with problems in your life, 7 different ways. We do not have time to go into this on this, but maybe we'll do a whole podcast on Qinglong sometime. But effectively, if you think there's 7 different ways of dealing with problems, different levels of dealing with problems. And then so if you take the vermilion bird of the south, Juque, then you would get 7 other things, 7 kind of other things. And it's quite interesting that what we talked about in terms of the underlying idea where the universe can affect what happens to a human being being taken in an exoteric way to say, if you're a Capricorn, then you're likely to meet your true love next week or something like that, this type of thing. Yeah. But you can see, again, the roots of it. Now, my feeling is that the Chinese did a rather better job of this, even the modern Chinese, because of their more animistic leaning culture. And people think in China that they have Taoism, they have Confucianism, and they have Buddhism, but actually there is a major 4th strand in China, which is Chinese folk religion. And Chinese folk religion is where all this stuff survives, and it's very closely interwoven with the other 3, as you might imagine. So very briefly, for instance, if we take Qinglong, the azure dragon, these things have a sequence. So the first thing you're taught is the jiao, the horns of the dragon. And this is like when you try to push a problem away from you. Then you get the kang, the neck of the dragon. That's like using a structure or using a strength or a root or stalwartness. We talked about bat. In order to deal with the problem effectively. And then we have D, which is the claws, or sometimes called the root, of the dragon. My Mandarin pronunciation, incidentally, is dreadful. I apologize. To manipulate the situation. This is the attempt to manipulate it. And then we have Fang, the chamber, which is to contain or close down the problem. Then we have Xin, the spirit, which is this is Chelicity. This is to join in spirit with the problem or the source of the problem. Say that's another human being. To join in spirit to gain understanding and knowledge of, for instance, we talked about early warning in the martial arts, by joining in spirit to get an understanding of the intent or what underlies a problem and resolve it that way. Then we got wei. This is the tail of the dragon. It's like sweeping or clearing away, So, for instance, somebody sits in their job, they hate it, they hate their job, they hate their boss and all this kind of stuff, and it just gets worse and worse every day. And one day they say, that's enough of that. And they walk out the door. I saw one guy on YouTube, he walked out the door with a brass band playing. That's kind of way, sometimes, when you're in a hole, you have to stop digging. And that's kind of what wei's about to a certain extent. And then finally, G. G's a really interesting one. The winnowing basket. It's okay. I'm afraid, Joe, we're going on a tangent here, but I'll try to keep it brief. So the farmer is out in the fields, and he's brought in the rice, and it's time to husk the rice. So he starts beating the rice with a rice flail. And then in the winnowing basket, he puts the rice or whatever other crop it is he's got, and he throws it up in the air and catches it. And the wind carries the chaff away, carries the husk or the chaff away. That's how he gets it off. While he's doing this, all the birds from the neighborhood, they all come and gather around, and they start trying to get the rice and get the chaff. So in Japan and China, once when I was in Japan, I saw this little dog doing just this, or just this kind of thing. And the farmer will have this little dog that's very, very enthusiastic, and it just runs around chasing these birds. It'll kill them if it can get them, chasing them away so the farmer can get on. So as the story goes, at the end of the day, the farmer and the dog are exhausted, and they go into the house. The dog's chased off all the birds. The farmer's been threshing the rice. They go in for a well-earned rest. Meanwhile, a special kind of bird called the ine suzume, a rice sparrow, has been sitting watching the commotion from some distance on a fence. And then when the farmer and the farmer and the dog go into the house, the ine suzume now fly in and eat the grain at their leisure. I guess you could say good things come to those who wait. Yeah, but these are the clever ones among the birds.
Very intelligent.
And this is another way, figuratively speaking, of dealing with problems in life. There's the danger with any of these things that I'm going to go on for hours with any of them. So we'll cut the Ashibashu at that point, the 28 mansions of Chinese astrology, and we'll move on.
Right.
So, more extensions of Chelicity. And this is coming into the second level. So a practice that I've practiced quite a lot, again, one of my guides, my teachers, is a practice that they stressed is very important, is something that I call earth breathing. It is simply the practice of Chelicity, but, we talked about becoming unconsciously aware of what you're happening with your breathing. So there are certain exercises and positions that we use for this earth breathing, and it's almost like in this exercise, it's almost like the earth starts breathing with you, and you can feel as the Japan, the nation of Japan in mythology was founded to a certain extent by a shaman queen called Himiko or Pimiko. And one of the wonderful things written about her, she stood on a mountain and she looked out over her realm and she saw what's described as the shape of all shapes as they move together as one being. This earth breathing is an exercise that helps you to come to experience the unity within nature. We tend to be conditioned to, through our lives and through education, to put things in little boxes. I certainly did this as an academic, I both as a student and as a lecturer. I tend to put things in little boxes, and we seem to be very happy once we've got everything in our little boxes, So I put something in a box and I put a label on it. Oh, there's my job done, Siberian shaman, yes. Tribal religion box, he goes in there, And then, a lama from Tibet, he can go in the Buddhism box, Oh, that's my job over. And unfortunately, nature's not as simple as that. So this is an exercise, this earth breathing exercise is a way of experiencing, a bit like Fan Quan's painting, experiencing, turning that idea on its head turning it on its head and directly experiencing the unity, the shape of all shapes moving together within nature. Another one, which I know something about, is the tradition of the shamanists that you mentioned, Nakyamamiki.
Just before we move on to that one, just for 1 second, go back to earth breathing. And is there an exercise somebody could do?
There is.
Just a simple exercise?
It's not quite simple enough for... It's a whole podcast, mate. But
okay, cool.
But there is.
Right,
let's cover it quite soon, yeah?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay. So the tradition that I think you brought up the first time, the tradition of this shamaness, this relatively recent shamaness who kicked off more than one religious tradition. There are a couple of, several religious traditions that she kicked off in in Japan. I think, as I said another time, she was active between, as a teacher or guide, she was active between about 1838 and I believe 1889, that sort of time frame. She did something that's quite common in esotericism. That's shamanism within settled societies. And also it is known in some full shamanistic societies. And this is this idea of automatic writing. That is where in a shamanic state, after working oneself into the shamanistic state, this would probably be deeper than normal chalisti, but certainly deeper into a shamanistic state, then writing in an automatic fashion. That is, as if the brush, and this is something I've tried myself, as if the brush itself is doing the writing. You're not doing the writing. And the particular shamaness we're talking about came up with this this wonderful work called the Ofudasake, which literally means the tip of the writing brush. And there are other Ofudasakes in what's known as the Shinshukyo, the traditions of the Japanese new religions. The Shinshukyo were a bunch of shamanistic and semi-shamanistic traditions that arose in Japan during what we would call the Victorian era and the early part of the 20th century. And so what I mean by automatic writing is she would go into like what people would call a trance or experience as a trance and literally just write fast and continuously. And famously, the particular person we're talking about in this shamanistic trance, obviously what she's trying to do is be driven by the spirit, by the kami. It was able to pen a very, very large number of verses, famously without making any mistakes whatsoever anywhere in doing so, which is phenomenal at high speed. What
I find amazing about that is you're in a shamanic state, which is kind of language plays very much a second part when you're in that state, and channeling that shamanic state into language is something,
Exactly.
Perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Difficult.
But the point is, it is, and also that brings us onto the subject of kotodama, words of power. That's what they would call kotodama in Japan. Words of power. These are sounds like, the shaman in Mongolia, Tengar, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Big booming voice. I'm making the actions, but of course we're on an audio podcast, nobody can see what they do, but maybe we could put that on a video or something sometime.
I have actually, I've seen a video of people doing that.
Yeah, and you
Tengra. It's the
Mongolian pronunciation is very, very hard. I've been trying for a long time.
It's like Tengri or something like that.
Yeah, what it is that they tell you when I studied Mongolian at university for obvious reasons. And what they tell you to do is put this sort of E sound on as a Westerner to make you try. It's sort of Tengri. It sort of makes you roll that R in something like the way the Mongols do it. But actually, the Mongols themselves don't put the E sound on the end. They just do that funny R sound. They don't need the E sound, but the E is supposed to help us rather than them. So words of power. There's another one I've tried. Done a lot of that kind of stuff. But again, we're going to take forever on this podcast if we go into it. Then there's Hitodama. Hitodama is a very similar kind of idea. So Kotodama and Hitodama. The Dama is kind of like a soul, almost like this concept of a soul, but a shamanistic concept of a soul. But it's not a soul like in, I don't know if you read De Anima by Aristotle, that it's not like that. What it is, it's some kind of entity. And Hitodama are very interesting. Again, my guide, one of my guides, taken me out in the woods. So actually, we did some of this in what you would call marshland or swampland, and preferably when it's incredibly dark in the state of chelicity. And out of the corner of your eye, when you do this for a long time, there's certain exercises associated with it. You can start to see these hitodama. Every now and again, you can see one. They're very fleeting, but you catch them out of the corner of your eye, and they're like lights. They're like I saw some scientist somewhere was describing them as atmospheric disturbances or something like that. But they are subtle things created by nature. And again, the purpose of chasing the kotodama or of hunting being a kotodama watcher is a bit like being a shamanistic bird watcher, it's like that kind of thing. So they're quite,
they're like little jewels.
I don't know about that, but they express themselves in terms of light, and they are different. They're not all the same, but the point is that it's simply an exercise to come in tune with nature. And again, kotodama, as with all these things, we've got to put our usual disclaimer. You don't want to be imagining this stuff, okay? It's very, very easy to imagine millions of kotodama. You can convince yourself you've seen them. It's not like that. The chelicity is vitally important in all of these things so that you're not imagining it. That brings us on to another famous Japanese shamanistic tradition, which is kind of what you mentioned, hanging yourself upside down from a tree by your toes and sticking things under your nails and going out in the snow and spending all night lying naked in the snow, or the most famous one of all, making hand signs and meditating under a waterfall. With your top off in the winter, this is what they call aragyo, severe austerities in Japan. And Japan is a country that does seem to like aragyo as a shamanistic technique. It is popular, but obviously other shamanistic traditions have this sort of thing as well. That is a way. In the past, when I was young, I used to describe it as cheating. It's a way of achieving chelicity. Because by using very heavy distractions from your normal way of thinking, and you can immediately see the purpose of it. Yeah. When we said, you use the rhythm of the drum to distract you, an account or something to distract you from your normal thinking. Well, aragyo does that in a big time to the point where I used to call it cheating. Yeah.
In some very sadistic way, it's, easier, should I say?
Yeah. Than what I would say is, if I want to do a spirit journey, I don't want to have to be hunting for a waterfall. So I do respect the people who do it and they have their traditions. It's not for me. I don't need it. And I think that.
Have you tried it?
Of course, I've tried it, mate. Have I ever?
Go on, you got to tell us what
that's a whole
very
podcast.
Briefly.
That's a whole podcast in itself. Okay, but we need to move on. So one of the things that we haven't really mentioned is healing. Shamans were very, in many cultures, shamans were dual purposed people. They were shamans. They're multi-purpose people. They were shamans, and sometimes they were chiefs, and sometimes they were healers. They would be the same person would have the healing skills. So, I guess the idea of using shamanistic technique to heal another person or even esoteric technique, is something that's quite widely known. Shamans would usually be experts in the use of herbs and wild plants for obvious reasons, for various things to help people with their health issues. But there is this kind of idea of, channeling the underlying spirit of nature in order to heal or to help somebody in a more direct, more shamanistic way than simply giving them some concoctions to drink or poultices or anything like that. And I've studied fairly extensively with of my teachers, the one that you know personally quite well. He is, I don't know if somebody would ever call themselves an expert in this subject, but he's certainly a person who understands this particular aspect of shamanism so in a lot of depth, and he wouldn't say that he's good at it, because as far as he's concerned, this is nature healing the person. It's not him healing the person. He's simply acting as a conduit for kami, for spirit, to heal a person. And this is a practice that goes under various names. The Sazuke is the one that you and I are familiar with, but it a kind of simplified, exotericized version of it, or version of something like that. I wouldn't say it's a version of it, but a version of something like that is much more widely known, and that would be a Reiki, the healing hands. Okay, so moving along, I don't know if we've mentioned the way that in ancient China, a lot of divinatory type of practice. This is, you remember we said shamans are strategists, and in those very, very early civilizations, like the Shang dynasty in China, shamans' roles morphed into political and strategic advisors. I mean, there were strategic advisors to the tribe, to the group. We said, where's the best place to spend the winter? But they kind of morphed into these strategic advisors and for want of a better word, ancient spin doctors for the rulers of these ancient civilizations. The Wang, we talked about, the guys who had control of this agricultural surplus, the rich guys. Yeah. And one of the practices that they employed in a big way in China, in a huge way in China, was this practice of scapulomancy, where they took the scapula as a bone of an animal. Or sometimes they used the undersurface of a turtle shell or something of that nature, and they would draw or paint with a brush various characters. These characters, incidentally, are the ones that became the forerunners of what today is the Chinese writing system. And they would drill a little bit of a hole in this piece of bone, and they would take a very hot metal implement, and again in the shamanistic state, they would push the metal instrument into the hole in the bone, and the bone would crack because of the heat, the very, very hot metal implement. And in the shamanistic state, they would use those cracks to trigger externally to themselves some changes within their shamanistic state, and therefore derived, if they were practicing it in a shamanistic way, they would derive something from nature through that, or it would help them pick up on those subtle cues. Obviously, the danger with scapulomancy and similar practices is
go on, sorry.
I was just saying they would exotericize it, and that's certainly what happened.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like the Qing, fortune telling and
exactly,
and flipping yarrow
exactly,
stalks,
and that's it. It fairly rapidly turned into that. So, but what you had was, it wasn't that early on it was pure shamanism and later on it was exotericism. What happened really was that the balance of people doing it shamanistically, there were always people doing it in an exoteric way, and there were always people doing it in a shamanistic way. But over time, as those Shang and the Xia, or the Xia, the earlier, almost semi-mythical dynasty in China, as those guys got going, the balance obviously changed from esotericism to exotericism over a period of time fairly quickly. And again, it's a very interesting history, because the Chinese were among the first people in the world to go through this process, moving from shamanism to exotericism. But, you could say also in Mesopotamia, again, at a very early date, this type of thing was happening. But the difference is the culture of ancient Mesopotamia is no longer with us today in its original form. In terms of China, that culture is with us in not too far away from its original form. So that's why China is such an interesting country to study when you're interested in esotericism, because that's the place where we have the best information about the best and most detailed information about how shamanism changes gradually into exotericism once agriculture and civilization gets started. So that's a practice that, again, another practice I've been engaged in. There are various things that in Japanese shamanism are called something like oharai. It's just like what you talked about. Do you remember you said sweeping away the dust as a way of thinking about a way to achieve chelicity? In Nakayama Miki's tradition, she would use literal chants like a shikyo haro te tasketame. This type of chant. In sweeping away that dust, she called it hokori, which just literally means dust in English. And in that process, achieving chelicity, sweeping away the dust. One of the things I just say about the automatic writing and this, if people do want to research Nakayama Miki, try to do that as much as possible in Japanese and as little as possible in English. That's my advice. There are, like in many traditions, there are issues, translation issues. I think we mentioned them in another podcast. There are some issues with translation, and exotericists, given a translation of something that was very written in a very esoteric way. For instance, the inner chapters of Zhuangzi in China would be another great example, or Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. These sort of books, it's not the greatest thing to read them in English. One of the things I did as an exercise at one point is I took some of these writings and made a sort of a concordance, so I could cross-reference English words against each other. And because my Japanese and Chinese aren't that great, through cross-referencing the use of the same word in a work, I could come to an understanding of what was really being said there without having to rely on the English translator. And through this process, I found that, as we said before, any language, and this is not a criticism of the translators, this is just a fact that when you try to convey esoteric teachings in any kind of language, you inevitably have to come down on solidify it into the language and culture of the time and place. And no matter which of these sources, take the Zhuangzi, you have to solidify it into the English of now, or the English of recent years. And of course, it wasn't written anything remotely recently, a couple of thousand years ago, getting on for, and
yeah. So you've got a completely different language and a completely different time as well.
So what I would say is that when you go and research these things and you see certain translations, don't allow your exoteric view of the world and pounce on certain phrases. Don't pounce on them and say, "Oh, I understand that because I fit that phrase." Like the guy who said, "Is that judo?" Yeah. Don't be the guy who said that, "Is that judo?" If you do want to research these different traditions, the Taoist or Nakayama Miki's tradition or anything of that nature, try not to be like that. That would be my advice. So,
unless, of course, you read, and the trumpet sound and the drums bang, and away we go to the seventh heaven.
Sure, and actually in Japan in general, you pretty much any Shinto priest, if you want, will do oharai for you. They'll come and sweep away your own dust. You'll have to see for yourself how effective that is and how exoteric or esoteric the activity is. But that function is available from pretty much a lot of Shinto priests in Japan.
I'll just make a brief point that chanting is obviously a technique to achieve a trance state in all sorts of traditions around the world, not just from Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sticking with Japan, there's a thing called the Yao Yorozu no Kami. It's a concept. Yao Yorozu means myriad, and Kami means spirit. So the idea that spirits are separate from each other is part of the exotericism that's associated with animistic cultures. And you know, as in shamanism, to the shaman, which is why the shaman's the odd one out, the shaman knows that these things are not separate from each other. They're deeply and intimately interconnected with each other. So taking this as a phrase, the Yao Yorozu no Kami, this idea of the myriad spirits all being one thing, this is a practice, or it's more than a shamanistic practice. It's like something you have to keep reminding yourself of. Again, I don't mean just on the baseline. I mean, you know what I mean by now. Baseline, midline, top line, all acting together, not separate from nature. But it's something that's to be kept as a focus, because it's very, very easy. And I have succumbed to this myself, to be honest. Even today, even though I know better, I still have a particular close relationship, if you like, with a particular spirit, a goddess, if you like, a Japanese goddess called Inari. And incidentally, in many forms of shamanism, especially in Siberia, Mongolia, shamans will take on a male shaman will take on a relationship with a female a guide or a female partner in the spirit world. And this person could be...
I can hear your brain trying to find the right word in English for that.
Exactly. Personified, but only on your baseline. Your baseline's personifying that. But you can, in this activity, and the particular one that I've had a fondness for is the Kami Inari, who's, again, it's animal spirits. Foxes are her animal spirits of choice. They're like her messengers, if you like. And I know this is just it's a mythological way of thinking about what are actually aspects of nature that she's not a real person, and she's not, foxes are not, but even today, because I've been engaged in activities surrounding around Inari. Inari's in folk religion in Japan, she's the goddess of good fortune. And interestingly, she provides what people sometimes say about her. She kills you with good fortune. She provides far more good fortune than you're ever likely to want. I feel blessed in some ways with this myself in my life. And what a lot of businessmen in Japan, because she's a popular deity with businessmen in Japan, if their business is successful, they'll donate a torii, what's called a torii, which is a gate, a kind of torii gate. I don't know if you've seen it. There's two posts with a bar across the top, often painted red or black. And they'll donate a torii to the shrine, Inari's shrine. And other people will donate these tories for whatever reason, because they feel some gratitude for the bounty that the goddess of fortune and bounty has bestowed upon them as they see it. And so you get these incredible rows of these gates, these torii gates that turn into almost like a tube, and almost like a tunnel, there are so many of them. And this has happened over many, many, many years. But if you want to see one of these things, there's actually a video by a Japanese pop band called Baby Metal. That band is slightly based on their image is slightly based on some of these Japanese folk religion concepts. And I believe that somewhere in that video there is actually a very short sequence of a camera basically moving through one of these tunnels made out of these donated torii gates. It's quite interesting. And there's lots of fox type of kitsune as fox, or megitsune in a female fox in Japanese. And so there's another interesting thing that I've spent some time on. Moving it across the way, back to China, and the things associated with the I Ching. The I Ching can be used to understand not just change, but also the relationships between things in the universe. Because in shamanism, esotericism, the whole universe is seen as a pattern of change. This is why I use the word woven energy. The whole universe is if you, in one way of analogizing it, the whole universe is a weave or tapestry of energy changes. And we ourselves are part of that tapestry, but it's not a static tapestry. It's not a static tapestry hanging on the wall. It's a continual changing, morphing tapestry of energy change. And the things within that tapestry are not separate from each other, as we've said. They're very, very interspersed. So this practice, sometimes called Jiao Yin, Chinese word, is using that understanding, the shamanistic understanding, to come to an understanding not only of the change, but also of the relationships between patterns within the change. And that in general is obviously done in terms of how I described the I Ching works between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And that leads you into the macrocosm aspect, leads you into this idea of sacred space, which is very important, in all forms of shamanism. They're demarcated in various ways. You can think that, for instance, in Britain, we got Stonehenge, right? This demarcation of a sacred space, an area that would be kept free free for nature to speak to the shaman. And in Japan, they will hang big white ropes around a space, or you can think of the sacred groves in Druidry and various other types of sacred space. And sacred spaces I will make for myself when I'm doing a lot of shamanistic practice. But there is a kind of modern descendant of this kind of activity, which I've also done a lot, which is in a form of chalicity. I do what's known as land art. There are various different types of land art. Land art is the idea of making art out of the natural world, rather than getting a set of paints and brushes and a canvas. It's going into the natural world and making art. Now, there are various different types of land art. The particular type of land art, the shamanistic type of land art that I've done quite a bit of in my time, is to arrange a sacred space such that it has the feeling of a human created pattern, but there is nothing about it that would lend you, on the baseline, you could say that was created by a human. And so what you're playing with when you do that kind of line art is this kind of balance between the baseline and the top line. You're not rejecting the baseline in this case. This is indulging in baseline activity. But what you're doing is trying to do baseline activity regulated by a set of rules. And the set of rules are the top line. There's nothing in that space that couldn't have arisen through natural patterns. It probably didn't. And you have this feeling about human constructed art, something like that about it. But it's so basically that's like constraining, using the top line to constrain the baseline, and that's another type of activity that I've been involved in.
Have you heard of the yantras in Hinduism?
I've certainly heard of them. I wouldn't claim to be an expert.
Well, I was just wondering if you put that into Google Images and just have a look, is that anything to do with what you're talking about, land art? It's like these patterns that have been constructed through deep meditative states.
Well, you can see in this type of thing, there's this idea of mudras as well in Buddhism, and various other patterns, artwork in esotericism as well. Artwork, for instance, in the Rosicrucian tradition, artwork is very important. That what esotericists and shamans are always trying to do when they are trying to explain their stuff in a shaman, they're just usually trying to explain it to their apprentice or the person they're guiding. In esotericism, they're probably trying to explain it to a broader number of people. You can't talk, as we've said many times, you can't talk directly with civilized language about this stuff. So what they start to do is they start using patterns like these, the yantras. They start using shapes like the mudras. They start using symbolism like you would get in Rosicrucianism. In Rosicrucianism, for instance, they use the analogy of the book M, the book Mundi, the world, the book of the world, learning from the world rather than learning from nature. But these are there is some my answer to your question is there's some relationship between this and what I'm talking about, but this is very, very clearly human constructed. Whereas what I'm talking about, you look at it, it looks like a natural scene. It looks like part of the wild. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe we could find some images of this type of land art again to link in with the podcast. But these sorts of things these things are not something that I particularly have any experience of, but I am aware of them. They're very prevalently used in Mikyo, what's called Mikyo in Japan, which is esoteric Buddhism. That is basically Buddhism that's been heavily influenced by shamanistic roots, shamanistic folk religion. So I would definitely say that there's some relationship there.
Cool. So how long is it? I know it's hard to put a number on, but let's just bring this back really simply. Chillicity, number one, stage one. How many years did it take you to be comfortable with your chillicity?
Oh, not long.
In terms of shamanic technique,
not long. I think I had through my martial arts practice, which I did, since I was very young. I think that I had some experience of that anyway, because to get to a certain level with martial arts, to a certain extent, you have to, what did we say? There's no time for a committee meeting when somebody's trying to punch you, so I had some experience of that. So I don't know how long it would have taken me without that, but it really didn't take very long. Maybe I start to get some aptitude with it within even 6 months of starting to practice.
Yeah. So get started, guys. Get started. Do it.
Sure. But we for us, we need to do a podcast on the subject, as you said, in some kind of depth. Chillicity. I mean.
Yeah, just some clear guidance on where to start, really, with chillicity would be really cool. And I think we are going to explore that next episode, so tune in for that one. That's going to be really fun. So thanks very much, Damon. I think this has been a great episode. It's given some people some insight into the life you've led, and it's probably going to be an advert for many future episodes to explore. I'm pretty sure we're going to explore some of the things you've talked about in much more depth in later podcasts. Sure. So let's look forward to those. And until next week, thanks very much, Damon, and see you soon.
Well, thank you, Joe.